Mazda, and that we humans have a moral duty to stand for truth, light, and wisdom.
And Ahura Mazda was one of the early monotheists. Could you say?
Well, it's I mean, technically this is what I call stereotheism. Monotheism means there's just one God.
Yeah.
This is stereotheism because there's two gods.
Okay, the
There's-
good and the evil.
Yes, quite. It's,
Okay, but we can't live without evil. If without it, we wouldn't know what good was. If everything was just good, sorry for interrupting, but if everything was just good, we divided it into good and very good.
yeah,
And the only good would become evil.
that is one sort of line of argument that's been taken here,
That's
and a fairly common philosophical argument.
Not very erudite.
Well, it's a sort of thing that, you know, when we discuss Zoroastrianism in schools.
Why did Nietzsche
They come up.
become fascinated by Zoroastrianism?
Well, Nietzsche was interested in the archetype, I think, a bit,
Ah.
rather than the details. I don't think Nietzsche really went into Zoroastrian studies very much.
Okay.
He used it as a sort of
Not
projection of his
to
own.
Christianity.
Well, that, yeah. And however, he didn't really know much about it, and he didn't know the
see.
details.
I see.
So what happened was, just to rewind a bit, Zoroaster saw himself as a spiritual saviour of mankind. If we follow the teachings of Ahura Mazda, we will make it as a planet. But he knew that people are liable to temptation and ignorance and power politics, and you just have to look around the world to see that, and corruption and so on. So every now and then another prophet has to come. And Zoroaster predicted that there would be future prophets who would re-emphasize what he was teaching. Now, what's interesting is that the Jewish inhabitants who'd been expelled from the Holy Land and gone to Babylon learned about Zoroastrianism and were influenced by it because it was the Persian king that set them free to go back to Jerusalem. And it was when they were there under the influence of the Zoroastrians that they actually compiled the Bible, the Old Testament.
Okay.
And the idea of the devil that creeps into the Bible in the temptation in the Garden of Eden, and life as a moral struggle between good and evil, that is, you know, was influenced by Zoroastrianism.
I see.
And most importantly, Zoroaster predicted there would come a Saoshyant, which means a Messiah. And that word was translated into Hebrew as Messiah.
I see.
So the Jews pinched this idea from Zoroastrianism of a Messiah.
The Messiah.
And ironically, the whole idea of being the chosen people of God actually was a Zoroastrian concept. So fast forward, when Christ was brought up by his very intelligent parents and trained like, you got a special mission in life, you know, all the signs at your birth and everything, we think you've got to be the saviour of our people. Actually, it was a Zoroastrian-inspired mission. And the word Christ, saviour, actually means the Saoshyant. And what's interesting is that the three Magi that come to baby Jesus when he's just been born are Persian priests. A Magi is a Persian priest.
Where does the word Magi come from? Is it?
It comes from the root ultimately of making, to make. So a Magi is someone who can use their knowledge to make new knowledge. It's a creative intellectual. And it's the root of the word magic.
Okay.
So a magician is a priest
magic.
of Zoroastrian thought, who can then be creative with that. Because the point is to do good. If you're a Magi, or a Magus in singular, like John Fowles' book, The Magus, you know, you have to do good
Yeah.
in the world. So, and then along comes Muhammad, later, 600 years after Christ, and says, well, we love Christ, he was a real prophet. He was fantastic, but he didn't quite pull off the mission, and now the Byzantine state have made him into a false god and an idol. So what we're going to do is re-emphasize the core mission. And no, actually, we're going to do absolute surrender to God. What's interesting is Muhammad was supported in this by some Zoroastrian intellectuals Salman the Farsi, who was one of the people that was involved in the Quran and its production, was a Zoroastrian priest. And he said of Muhammad, this guy is the real Sayyid. He's going to pull off this and bring us all back to Ahura Mazda and defeat the devil. So all these ideas of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, they all are rooted in Zoroastrianism, actually. And when I discovered that, which is a secret not shared by all scholars because they only look at their own religion,
I bet, yeah.
it means that it's quite important that we get it right, you know.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you for that. That's,
so it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah.
And then I will just add one other bit of detail here that's interesting, because when Alexander conquered Persia, because the Persians had this huge empire, they were the first really big empire, and unfortunately they misunderstood perhaps what Zoroaster was saying. He was talking about an ethical wisdom. He didn't mean Persians go out and conquer everybody in the name of Ahura Mazda. It became a militarized thing. And of course, when they tried to conquer the Greeks said, no, you're not conquering us. And the Persians unfortunately burned the temple of Athena in Athens. They did, some rather naughty stuff. So that created Greek-Persian turbulence. Whereupon, a few generations later, Alexander the Great went and conquered Persia, tit for tat. And their great complex at Persepolis went up in flames. And it burned the archives. To me as a scholar, this is a tragedy, to lose the texts, right?
Okay.
However, some of them remained. Some of the great scholars of Zoroastrianism had written down their holy books and got them out in time. But it wasn't until, this is an extraordinary story, until the 18th century that a Frenchman, Anquetil Duperron, went to Bombay and befriended the Zoroastrians and managed to copy their texts and bring them out. And then he translated them into French, translated into English. And that is what's called the Gathas of Zoroaster.
The what?
The Gathas.
Gathas.
Hymns of Zoroaster.
Gathus. No.
A-S. Gathas.
Gathas.
Yeah. And so among the other texts they had was a sort of, like a kind of Bible, the Denkard it's called, which gives their cosmological history of creation. So the story goes as following. This war between good and evil has been going on long before this planet was formed. So this is like a sci-fi war in the heavens between the forces of good and evil. Think, the Empire of Light versus the Klingons or something, which has been going on for zillions of years. And both sides were tired and getting bored, so they decided to have one final battle. And they created this planet to be the battleground of the final battle. And they created humans, us, to be the front line. So depending on how things go down on this planet, right, this is the last stand of Ahura Mazda against the forces of evil.
It's Ragnarok to the Vikings.
The Norse would call this Ragnarok,
Yeah.
So this is crunch time.
That explains a lot. That explains why you've listed 82 conflicts between 1994 and 2011.
That seems to explain why there are so many conflicts going on. And I'm with Zoroaster because I love the Afghan people, I love the Islamic people, I love all the kind of Middle Eastern cultures. That's why I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. But the truth we need is very, very ancient. And what's going on in Syria at the moment is we have simplistic theologies like Islamic fundamentalism attacking and killing more sophisticated, more obscure, esoteric theologies like the Yazidis or the Alawites or the Christians, and saying, they're evil. I think the problem is when you start throwing "you're evil" around.
If you're not with us, you're against us.
Yeah, this is the problem.
Totalitarianism.
It's just simplistic philosophy.
Yeah.
Trumpism.
It's what?
It's-
Trumpism.
it's-
Trumpism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Well,
it's
I've
Brexit.
heard an intelligent
Brexit.
Irish woman say that too. That to her it was vegetarianism.
Ah,
But she wasn't stupid, but I was shocked.
she was for or against it, you mean?
Oh, she was very vegetarian. Yeah,
Okay, an
yeah.
extremist. Yeah,
Well, she loved animals. Her father was a vet, I think.
sure.
But, no, I should have challenged her about it. But
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very important, I think, to keep tolerance, and that's why I like Aristotle, who tried to find an ethics of the mean between extremes. And he later, his ideas became very influential in the Islamic philosophical world. As
and
we've seen.
Democritus was usually he was suppressed by the Christian Church, was he not?
Democritus is an
teaching.
atomic theorist, isn't he?
But he wrote about everything, according to the Italian physicist, who's Carelli.
Carlos Rovelli?
Carlos Ravelli, yeah.
I'm not familiar with him.
He wrote, he's fantastic.
Okay. No, many people like Democritus.
Yeah.
And he would figure in our table, but we're not going to discuss him at the moment, if that's okay. Because
You
he's not
prefer
in this.
Aristotle,
Well,
would you say?
yeah.
You find it more interesting?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think, well, we have more of him. I mean, I'm sure if
Yeah,
we had
yeah,
more of
Because
Democritus,
the Christians got rid
we
of
might
him.
find him.
Well, Democritus's writings, according to Ravelli.
Yeah,
Maybe
well,
right
I'll
or
look
wrong.
into that.
He may be wrong.
I'll look into it. Anyway, so that's it. We're at crunch time. And my view is we should lay all the cards on the table, study them all, learn the entire pyramid table, and become more wise in our dealings with one another, and no longer have to demonize or label each other as evil, and realize we're all shades of rainbow, which is the point of the table's color scheme. And I pray that we don't have a shooting war between Israel and America versus Iran, because that would really be stupid. And I mean, I'm no doubt, of course, America has the firepower and the bombs to desecrate and destroy an ancient civilization, just as Israel's done in Gaza, for instance. You can imagine every single Iranian city turned to rubble, but I'm not sure that China and Russia would just stand back and let that happen. I mean, the UN has shown it's toothless, it couldn't do anything to prevent it, but I think there are powers that could prevent it. And I think the most important power is the power of conscience within us in the West. We've got to take the non-violent path to solving our conflicts. And anyway, that would be Zoroaster's position, I think.
Well, thank you very much for
Okay,
that
no
explanation.
problem. So let's move on and look at the next one, which is, comment.
You open the door for
Sure.
me.
Ah,
As you say, we should not use violence to solve the conflicts.
sure.
And with the first phase of the philosophy club, we spoke about Trump and Putin, but we did not spoke about Europe. And my concern, it was very heavy because Macron made a discourse, and also German important person said we have to go to war against Russia. We have to prepare ourselves. So I think it's very disappointing for me. And what do you think about that?
There are different ways. So as a Druid, and the Druids date back to at least the time of Zoroaster, if not before, I think there are different ways of waging war. I think we are, all of us, waging a war against the forces of ignorance, evil, stupidity. And, when they capture a state, as in Putin's control of Russia, they've captured a state, then I think one should wage war, but one can do it non-violently, as Tolstoy would say. One should do it through education, through learning, as Navalny was trying to do, and as Russian Democrats are trying to do. You see, if Europe was clever, we wouldn't have let it get this far. We should have been doing, if the European Union had done what I suggested when I wrote to them in 2009, they would have set up a European Union mediation service. We should have helped Ukraine and Russia reach a peace deal in 2009, 2010. when I saw the first flickerings of conflict there. But you know,
I
it's
think Macron's jets are just shooting down incoming missiles. They're not shooting down aircraft with pilots in them. You know, when they hit a missile, there's no life lost. There's life saved.
Yeah, I understand that, but this it's not my point. When I see Macron speaking, he say we have to reestablish military service and prepare for war. And
Okay.
the European Union, we have to make 80 billion
Really?
euros
Available
to make
for
weapons.
weapons.
This is a discourse. It's incredible,
Yeah. Jeez.
and I'm very ashamed of that.
I think it shows a lack of imagination, because if we put, you know, a tiny proportion of 80 billion into peacemaking initiatives, peace diplomacy, we could get peace between Russia and Ukraine. And that's what I'm working for. That's why I'm trying to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for them. I mean, you know, Russia has its own perspective on the origin of the conflict.
Yeah.
Ukraine has a totally different perspective. We have to bring them into the dialogue, and they have to both drill down into the history of the conflict, going right back, you know, to you know, the whole Bolshevik experiments in Ukraine and the whole thing. I think, as a intellectual who believes in freedom of speech and freedom of research, what upsets me about you know, this discourse is it becomes propagandistic on both sides, and we don't have freedom of thought, freedom of actual exchange going on. That's what I would like, and that's why I want to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which could be funded for a tiny fraction of 80 billion.
But still, as
Yeah.
a people, of course, it's not a political club; it's a philosophical club. But it's nice we can express different point of view and say, for example, you are ashamed by Putin and Trump, and I will say I am ashamed by Macron, and that's at least what we can do as a people.
Sure.
Because of course I have not the buttons to help one another, or but
Yeah. So, yes. Well, I mean, political philosophy is part of, you know, our work, and it's box number 165. So maybe next week we can look at political philosophy and get into that in more detail.
or maybe we could make an extra a different type of philosophy club, maybe
To discuss.
once in a while.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I will just say one thing. This is a whole, you know. So when the mayor came round here
Yeah.
just recently, and I took him into the politics room, Calliope, and we were talking about politics. And my mother was a Marxist. I was doing a commentary on Das Kapital, and you know, he was saying, very interesting, you know. And then we went up to the top floor, and I have a poster up there from La France Soumise about ceasefire, you know. And he said, and I didn't know the history, and he said, oh, that's Mélenchon. And then I said, yeah, okay, extreme left guy, right? And then he said to me, he said, yes, you know that Mélenchon chap, he's a bit of an anti-Semite, he said. Now, I didn't know that. I assume the mayor knows what he's talking about. So there is a sort of left-wing anti-Semitism which then wants to blame international conspiracies. So what I would just say here, and it's a huge question, is when Russia invaded Ukraine, anti-Semitism was part of the ideology of the invasion. There's a very important analysis by Tim Snyder, my American counterpart, who you know, points out that Russia under Putin has taken an anti-Semitic turn. Officially, it's part of their ideology. And that's why they hated Zelensky so much. He also deconstructed the interview that Trump, Zelensky and Vance had in the White House. And Snyder said the reason they were going for him is because they are also anti-Semitic in their thinking. And apparently Trump, and many commentators have said this, Trump is a serious anti-Semite in private, but people are now revealing that, right? And so he had a chance to like bash a Jewish guy. And what Snyder points out, as a professor who studied anti-Semitism in history, this is a classic case of anti-Semites bashing a Jewish guy, telling him he has to apologize, even though he's done nothing wrong, looming over him, telling him he's wrong, and humiliating him publicly. And I was shocked when I reread it and I revisited that interview. It's true. And that explains, it's not just Trump's ideology, it's the whole MAGA movement. They have this streak of anti-Semitism, which I don't share at all. I'm a philo-Semite, and I want all the Semitic peoples to live in peace and harmony. The thing about anti-Semitism, which was popularized by Hitler, of course, but it predated him, is that it's a form of totalitarian explanations of history. It's a total explanation. If the Jews are absolutely evil, they are the devil, they're the children of Ahriman, then it follows logically that if we destroy them all, everyone can live in peace. And that was the thinking behind anti-Semitism in the time of Hitler. And which I don't agree with its premises.
For example, when they were allowed to be money changers, but they couldn't do much else.
So they were forced to do that.
Yeah.
By medieval
around
church.
Europe. Yeah.
And then, of course, periodically the church would do pogroms and attack them.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is a mess. And what I would like to do is deconstruct all this, have that honest conversation with Trump, Putin, Melanchthon, Macron.
Nuance, because
go into the nuances.
Yeah.
Instead of like throwing missiles at each other, let's talk this stuff through and reach a kind of a wisdom position.
This sort of flips the thoughts that Putin, when he went into Ukraine, was going to get rid of the Nazis.
Snyder points out the irony of this. It's the total opposite. It's propaganda.
And the same goes for Trump's. He's such a buddy with Netanyahu.
It's like two vipers, in secret, Trump hates Netanyahu, and vice versa. Netanyahu said off camera, America's defeated, we've controlled it, because there is another thing, if we're going to have the conversation honestly, there's anti-Semitism, there's also anti-Gentilism, which is a very old thing too, among die-hard Zionists and Israeli nationalists going back to ancient times, who loathed and hated the Gentiles, wouldn't let them in the temple, wouldn't regard them as being of any value, they're unclean. So there's anti-Semitism and anti-Gentilism. They're both as bad as each other, in my opinion. And what I stand for is, I think, what Christ was teaching, which is, hey guys, calm down. Let's try love, right? That was, I think, what Christ was trying to say in his teachings at that time. I don't care if you're a Gentile or a Jew. Wisdom is for all of us. There's one God, one Father in heaven, above us all. That was, I think, the insight of Christ. And I think it's a valid and still necessary insight. I'm putting that in my commentary on Matthew. But anyway, hey, let's move on to look at, but thanks for raising that, deep stuff. Let's look at the Chinese one, Moism. I think, was it you that asked for that, or
me?
You, okay. Right, this is an interesting tradition. A Chinese philosopher called Mo Tzu, who taught universal love. He didn't agree with Confucius, which is we should all pay attention to status and hierarchy and follow the right rules and the right rights and everything. He said no, the Tao is love. Actually, it's an incredibly Christian kind of concept, like a Christ thing. and that he taught this idea that if we follow the law of love, everything will fall into place. And he lived about 400 BC. It didn't catch on. He wrote a book called the Book of Mo Tzu. He believed in God and the gods, and he felt that they should also follow the universal law of love. If the gods, instead of fighting amongst themselves, let's just imagine we've got Ahura Mazda and Angramenu fighting, what Mo Tzu was saying is just love each other as gods and make peace through that. He said rituals won't help, but love will. And he was a pacifist, which didn't go down well with the Emperor of China, which, was quite militaristic. He believed in harmony and universal love and benevolence. It's a really interesting tradition. It's very minority flavour in Chinese thought, but very similar to Christ's findings, but 400 years earlier. And it's still going. There are philosophers in China that still say Mo Tzu was correct, But so, and it's a minority flavour, but it deserves a box because it's still important, I think. Yeah.
And was it very different from Confucianism?
Well, yes, it was less ritualistic and it was less about law. Confucius believed more in right order in society.
He was conservative, one could say.
He was a radical. We call him a progressive conservative, in Canadian terms.
Okay.
Progressive conservative.
Okay.
He wanted, he felt society would be ordered if we pay attention to the invisible realm and all respect each other, with due protocol. Mo Tzu said, yes, but let's just jump to the final end, which is universal love. So it was interesting. Okay, let's move on to our Baha'i friends, which is 101. And they are from Persia. Now, the Baha'i religion is part of the new religious movements because technically it was founded in the 19th century. And I've met many Baha'is when I was working in the interfaith world in London. We used to meet at the Baha'i headquarters. They have centres in most parts of the world. There's a Universal House of Justice in Haifa, in Israel.
There are so many headquarters in London.
Well, we're a very religious people, the British. And,
Oh dear me.
London is a deeply, well, it was, important place. No, the headquarters of the Baha'is in London is just the British Baha'is. They're the ones I know. The French one would be in Paris, and so on.
Okay.
Each country has its headquarters there. And the universal headquarters is in Haifa, in Israel. But anyway, so it's a very interesting tradition, and it merged out of Sufism and Shi'ism, which is the Iranian form of Islam. And as I explained earlier, Islamic mysticism always believed that Muhammad's work wasn't completely finished. That, Muhammad was one of a chain of prophets, and that there's going to be coming other ones who will complete and fulfill the work. And the Baha'is believed that Baha'u'llah, who came in the 19th century in Persia, was the fulfillment of that. And they believe, of course, because they're coming from Persia and they've read their Zoroaster, that Baha'u'llah is actually the Sayyid. So Muhammad was almost the icing on the cake, but then what he did also didn't complete the work, and it ended up being a misogynistic religion which persecutes people that don't follow the right rules of prayer rituals, and they ended up being focused on the outer thing. Whereas what Baha'u'llah said is that Islam has got to reform and become much more liberal in its ideology, much more gender friendly and He believed in human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and he wrote some marvellous books, and they believe that Baha'ism is an update of revelations from God, following on from Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, all of whom they respect. But they believe that Baha'u'llah is the one that gave them the final word from God. They believe in non-dogmatism and openness to truth wherever found. And peace and reconciliation are paramount, so they don't believe in extending religious belief through force. They use just persuasion, argument, and example. There are Baha'is around the world working for peace, disarmament, human rights. I know some amazing Baha'i women in Britain, particularly, one of whom now lives in Ohrid in Macedonia, who is Persian. And they believe that humanity is moving towards a period of universal peace, and that there will come a just world government for mankind in which all our nationhoods can be reconciled. There are Baha'is in Russia, there are Baha'is in Serbia, Yugoslavia, in Canada, all over the world. They believe in kindness to animals, harmony with the environment, and replacing international violence and conflict with mediation and arbitration. The Baha'i Universal House of Justice is based in Haifa. They also believe in personal immortality, so the soul survives death. There's a spiral of eternal life progression, so the writings of Baha'u'llah are firm on that, which is similar to Christianity and Islam. But we will be judged on our personal actions individually, not whether we were of this sect or this cult or this nation. Life is here as a moral journey for us to experience, and each of us has to be answerable to the ultimate divine will. So they're beautiful people. Unfortunately, they were persecuted by the Iranian Shia dominant clergy, and they were called heretics and apostates. And Baha'u'llah was arrested, and he was imprisoned for decades, initially in Persia, and then the Russian consul to Tehran managed to negotiate his release, and he was exiled to the Ottoman Empire, and then the Ottomans imprisoned him. And he spent 10 years in house arrest in the Ottoman realms, and he ended up near Haifa under house arrest. And incredibly, during World War I, when the fighting was going on, the British managed to rescue the guy from the chaos, and so then the Baha'i religion was kind of saved. So it's done a lot of work on the UN. It's now there's a chap called Dan Perel who works in New York helping with UN reform. They're trying to make the UN more democratic, and they just had this thing, the Summit for the Future, which he played a role in. So they're quite interesting as a new religious movement. There's about 10 million Baha'is around the planet at the moment.
When you have two figures, you have...
Yes, the 10 million is the current. 100 million is the so far running total. There have been about 100 million Baha'is in all of history up to now.
Yeah.
And there's about 10 million at the moment.
About mainly which countries?
I think scattered all around the world, actually. But ironically, probably not much in Iran, because they are persecuted there, and they're called heretics still, which is a tragedy. I was a research fellow at the Iranian University in Qom, the University